Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me well, and warm welcome to this PGI Learning Forum focusing on a conversation, as you would have seen, between Islamic Relief Worldwide and IFRC on lessons learned on protection, gender and inclusion in humanitarian work. There's just a few people still joining, so we'll just give it like another minute or two. Anybody who wants to have their camera on for the beginning, just to say hello and so we can see all the people around the world who are joining us, you're welcome to. Of course, entirely up to you. And just while we're doing that, we'll take 1 or 2 minutes to make sure everybody's in the right place. So welcome, and in 2 minutes, I will start introducing our speakers. Yes, I think everybody who is joining on Teams, somehow Teams, I think in its Microsoft's ambition to take over the conferencing world, is doing very well, because they're trying to force the Teams link onto a Zoom meeting, but people are joining from there. We've got the link in there, so it should be fine. Okay, a few more people joining. Okay, so 2 minutes past 3 in Geneva, 2 minutes past 2 in England, and let's get started. It's great to see lots of people here joining, and once again a warm welcome. This is, I think, the 5th issue or iteration of this Protection, Gender and Inclusion Learning Forum, and the first one where we've had external speakers. I'm particularly happy to have the wonderful speakers from Islamic Relief Worldwide, and let me introduce both our speakers from IRW and also my colleagues and dear friends from IFRC, who will be together having this conversation about protection, gender and inclusion issues. So starting, at least on my screen on the left, we have Naja Al-Mugahed. She's the Inclusion, Protection and Gender Advisor for Islamic Relief Worldwide, working on mainstreaming gender in IRW's offices around the globe. In that role, working on supporting staff in building capacity in gender-sensitive programming and strengthening protection and inclusion as well. Her work's very much influenced by the faith-based nature of the organization, but also derived from the universal standards and approaches. She's doing this work based on 10 years of experience working in the development, gender, women's empowerment area. And that's also supplemented by her academic background and administering development programs with that particular focus on gender-based violence programming. So welcome, Naja, great to have you with us. You're joined by Shaheen, your colleague, Shaheen Ashraf, MBE, head currently of the Global Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide, and leading on the advocacy strategies on gender, climate change and refugees. Previously managed, directed and co-created other faith-based organizations focused on women and refugees and disability issues. Also working with minority communities in the UK and in the US, and bringing 25 years of experience in this sector with expertise in faith development and intersection of social inclusion and social protection. And recently elected as a trustee and vice chair of the board of International Council of Voluntary Agencies, known as IFRC. So thank you very much, Shaheen, for bringing all of this expertise with you. It's greatly appreciated. Then we have invited, as you know, as you are representing both IFRC and IRW in the audience here. And so that's great to have a diverse group. So for the benefit of those who don't know Amjad and Lisa, coming from Islamic Relief Worldwide, let me introduce them. They're, as I say, my dear colleagues, and it's a great privilege to have this discussion between the 4 people. Amjad, starting Dr. Amjad Mohammed Salim, he's the manager of the Inclusion Protection Engagement Unit at IFRC, International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, based in Geneva. And the team that he manages is a global team focused on protection, gender and diversity, inclusion, education, youth engagement and learning, among other things. He applies consistently his extensive knowledge on peace building, humanitarian affairs and development work, and interfaith engagement in many domains, not only within IFRC, but as a board member of the Geneva Peace Building Platform, People Beyond Borders, and EduSpots. He's published many articles, many book chapters on those themes: peace building, humanitarian work and development work, and including a book on lessons from Aceh. And he's also an alumni of International Visitor Leadership Program and the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and has probably too many degrees to mention, actually, but the most recent and probably fascinating one was a PhD from Exeter University, also with an MBA from Singapore and an engineering master's from Imperial College London. So we won't ask Amjad to try to synthesize all of that extensive knowledge in the 90 minutes that we have, but we'll be fascinated to see all the links there. And then last but certainly not least, Lisa Akero, who is the Gender and Diversity Coordinator for IFRC. Her main focus currently is PGI in emergency, so protection, gender and inclusion in emergency response. And also protection, gender and inclusion and related issues within institutional organizational work. Lisa's favorite place to be is active and out in the field and supporting people directly. And her most recent mission to do that was on a search and rescue ship in the central Mediterranean. So supporting the search and rescue and care and concern and of migrants in that context. She has many years behind her as a case manager for survivors of trafficking persons and sexual and gender-based violence. And she also holds a master's in disaster management and has done many field missions, again, too numerous to mention. So it seems a little bit cruel to only spend 8 minutes going through the fascinating background of our 4 speakers, but I hope that gives a bit of a flavor of the depth of discussion that we can have in the next 90 minutes. And thank you to all of 52 of you for being here today for that discussion. My name is Stephen Wainwright, and I'm the Social Inclusion and Protection Coordinator at IFRC. And this conversation between Islamic Relief Worldwide and IFRC started out by hearing some of the comments and knowing some of the emphasis of Islamic Relief Worldwide that we'd heard in different conversations, in conferences and in interagency meetings. And we're hearing, very similar problems, to be honest, that our colleagues were experiencing in terms of mainstreaming and integrating protection, gender inclusion issues in their work, and seeing that there was a big emphasis on that, and seeing the successes as well. But we sort of connected on the same perspective of seeing the importance of all those issues and knowing that it's not always so easy to get them done. So that really brought this sense of some kind of unity between the two focus of the 2 units, all the similar functions, both equally interested in applying an intersectional framework. So looking at gender with all of the other aspects of how people can be excluded and marginalized. And also looking at linking policy and programs and advocacy and institutions and seeing that all of those things need to be addressed together. So we really found a lot of common points there. Lots of similarities, lots of differences as well. Of course, the particular nature of Islamic Relief Worldwide is a faith-based organization inspired by Islam, implementing that approach, the intersectional approach from that perspective. A particular focus on gender justice, and we've been fascinated to hear more about that. And IFRC, in turn, a similar approach to really bringing together a lot of different threads and strands and aspects of protection, gender and inclusion work, and also inspired by a set of principles or a kind of a moral code, one could say, the principles and values of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and how we bring together all these different aspects to be as effective as possible for people who are affected by violence, discrimination, and exclusion. So just to frame a little bit how we came to be having this conversation with all of you today, and it's building on conversations that we've had in the past. having said all of that, just admitting the last guests from the waiting room, and we can head into some questions to our guests. And we will start maybe, as we do have, and I can't see quite how many people from the two organizations, but we definitely have a bit of a balance between the two. So just for a brief kind of, again, setting the stage, if I could ask Nadja, first of all, just to give, the briefest of overviews of what is Islamic Relief Worldwide. What's the history, what's the mission, and what's the context that we're talking from here for those who maybe don't know the details of the organization.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and it's a pleasure being with you today. I can see a lot of familiar names among the list of participants, so I believe myself and my colleagues are keen to learn from your experience as well in IFRC, how we have kind of manage or work on gender inclusion protection. To answer your question, actually, last week we celebrated our 38th anniversary, which in comparison to IFRC is quite a young organization. Islamic Relief was founded in 1984 in response to famine in Sudan by a small group of doctors and activists in a small office in Birmingham. They raised funds door to door, mosque to mosque, and from there it grew to become the organization we know today, in presence in more than 40 countries around the world. Using the sector's language, we are an international NGO with a diverse portfolio of programs that respond to humanitarian crises. And those programs are diverse in terms of sectors. So we work on health, education, cash and livelihood, water and sanitation, climate change adaptation, protection, inclusion, etc. As you can see from our name, we would also identify ourselves as a faith-inspired organization. And that mainly shapes our values, our mission, our vision, and some of our policies as well. So I'm going to speak about that later. But it is a very important element of our identity as an organization. We have also been certified against the core humanitarian standards, which is a global standard for organizations that work in humanitarian field. And we are one of 5 UK-based charities that have been certified by the core humanitarian standards. To answer your question around our mission, if you allow me to read out loud what we have in our global strategy, we actually have 3 points around reducing the humanitarian impact of conflict and natural disasters, empowering communities to emerge from poverty and vulnerability, and mobilize people and funds to support our work. Whilst I was preparing for today's webinar, I was going through our documents and our reports, and I came across one of many stories that I'm sure you can all relate to and reflect on. One of the communities we work with, she said, and I quote, that without our work within Islamic Relief, she works as an agricultural business in Malawi. She's a mother of 4, and she received training and support for her agricultural business. So I just want to quote what she said. She said, "I don't know where my family would be without your support. We now have enough to eat, and our children no longer go to school with an empty stomach." I think that's just a reminder to all of us who work on this sector of who we are and what we actually aspire to do. It's to serve those communities that we work with. That's in a nutshell. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Nadja. That's a very evocative summary of what the organization is trying to achieve. Amjad, let me pass over to you, and maybe a similar summary of a bit of the history of the mission of IFRC for those who maybe don't know all of the background.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome to everyone here. Thank you for joining us. And first of all, let me just say it's a great pleasure to be once again on a platform with Islamic Relief. I actually started my humanitarian career out with Islamic Relief, so it's nice to be be sort of sharing this platform again. I would actually say, having known both organizations, there's a slight similarity between how the Red Cross movement started and how Islamic Relief started. So, the Red Cross, all those years ago, in the late 19th century, 1863 or so around that time, started from this idea that we need to give volunteers need to be mobilized to be giving care to the wounded in battle, and regardless of who they were. And out of that, the concept of the Red Cross, the concept of the Geneva Conventions, the concept of the International Committee of the Red Cross was formed. And as governments also started to warm to the idea of the Geneva Conventions and signed up to it, there was national Red Crescent societies were established that were seen to act as relief auxiliaries to the authorities in emergencies. Fast forward from then to about 1919, so a year after the Spanish flu epidemic, the concept of a coordinating body to bring the various national societies that had grown, I think at that time it had probably grown to about 15 or 20 Red Cross societies across the world, to coordinate that was sort of formed. And so the International Federation, or in that stage it was called the League of the Red Crescent Societies, was established in 1919 to effectively coordinate that, to inspire, encourage, facilitate, and promote at all times all forms of humanitarian activities by national societies. And that, so it formed very much a coordinating basis, and from that it grew, and it became the Federation later on. So we as a Federation, we are the secretariat for these 192 now national Red Crescent societies across the world, with 14 million volunteers, reaching approximately 1 billion people annually with our disaster response, disaster risk reduction, long-term programs. Our remit is really on coordination during times of natural disasters, but also more importantly, organizational development. So working with national societies to help them to respond on the ground. We have, of course, 3 strategic goals, particularly for the next 10 years, where the first one is about people anticipating, responding to, quickly recovering from crisis, people leading safe, healthy, and dignified lives and having opportunities to thrive, and people mobilizing for inclusive and peaceful communities. And so the concept of protection, gender inclusion is a cross-cutting part of all of these 3 themes. But in particular, our focus for us as the team that is here today, we focus on the third one, which is on inclusive and peaceful communities. And so the Red Cross is not, or the IFRC and the National Red Cross Societies are not just humanitarian agencies, right? You can see that they have other mandates, sort of looking at long-term development as well, even though we're probably not known much more for our humanitarian response. Let me stop there, Stephen, and happy to answer any other questions.
Great, thank you, Angela. That really puts us in context, and certainly particularly interesting to be reminded of the commonality of the origins of the 2 organizations. We could certainly talk about the history of both for a long time, but let us get into some more sort of recent focus questions. And I'm going to start turning to you, Shaheen. One of the things that we had talked about previously was how we bring in rights-based approaches, humanitarian principles, international legal frameworks to humanitarian work within the 2 organizations, not just for the sake of doing it, but as a means and as a support to addressing issues of violence, discrimination, and exclusion. So could you share with us a bit the main aims of IRW's approach within that context?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Amjad and Najah, for your introductions as well. I want to thank IFRC for hosting this event alongside Islamic5 Worldwide, and I think it's one of many yet to come. So thank you, Stephen, for ensuring that we get to this stage, and thank you for your persistence on getting Najah and myself on the calls. Yeah.
The meeting was canceled, or people are not texting?
I think somebody else's microphone is on.
Yeah, I'll turn the microphones off. Please do keep yourselves on mute, though, if you're not invited to speak. Go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think one of the question was around how the two organizations approach embedding a rights-based approach. You know, since the kind of the 1990s, we've seen a really well-established concept of informing the work of diverse actors within the development and humanitarian aid sector. And what is emerged from that is the increasingly interesting narrative around faith-based organizations who have actually embraced the concept, although not without contestation. You know, for example, we have data from Pakistan that show that global rights-based approaches norms are operationalized, particularly at local context. And what you see in that is this amazing normative diversity and identity that comes out with three dominant normative frameworks used within the NGO sector. You know, you've got your humanitarian standards, which they have and which we have. Then you've got your citizens' rights. That's what we have. And then you've got your Islamic principles. And I think this is where, although we may differ, but those principles really do embed themselves into the humanitarian standards and within citizen rights. And what that reveals, Stephen, is that you see the significance within that, and we do specifically within Islamic5, the role of religion and the religious actors that we work in terms of the translation of those rights. For example, you know, you can have a conceptual distinction between instrumental and substantial modes of engagement, you know, and a framing that allows more of that is how humanitarian actors deal with religion and rights. And that was, you know, often what we find in studies is that the humanitarian action that comes from that. So from the Islamic5 perspective, you know, you asked about the approaches that we take. Najah has already mentioned this, you know, we adhere to the principles and standards outlined in the core humanitarian standards, the sustainable development goals, you know, and today we'll be speaking specifically to those, you know, goal 5. You know, we're part of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. We're part of the humanitarian inclusion standards for older people and people with disabilities. We're part of, and I'm a deputy on the Interagency Standing Committee, you know, on gender-based violence guidelines as well. So we're signatory to the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Code of Conduct, which actually prioritizes humanity and impartiality in humanitarian responses. So adhering to international humanitarian law, when it's required in the areas that we work with. And so what happens is that throughout our work, Islamic5 strives through these kind of multidimensional facets to understand the real causes of poverty and inequality, Stephen. And what happens is, and what Najah, what I'm assuming will speak to, is the mainstreaming of the protection and the inclusion of that, which is a key part of that understanding. And it stems about from the awareness that we have around what you spoke about earlier, which is the intersectionality of inequalities relating to gender, relating to age, relating to disabilities, and, you know, the rights of children, all of which, as you said, and our colleagues will speak to, are heightened during crisis. So for Islamic5, going back to the rights-based approaches, we are adopting those approaches, and we're recognizing more and more how inequalities are simultaneously gendered by other social dimensions, such as disability and age. And just like IFRC, we protect the dignity and the safety of the people that we serve, respecting their voice, respecting their agency and their choices, while upholding the universal right to be protected from harm.
Yeah, thank you, Shaheen. That's so clearly put, and it's you know, both in the depth of the influences and in the way that it's being translated into, you know, useful support for the organization. And I think one of the common points, perhaps it's an assumption, but you know, a focus on rights and rights-based is not what most people would assume either IFRC or Islamic Relief Worldwide would particularly focus on. So maybe as I come to Amjad and ask for some comparisons on the IFRC approach, it could be part of that reflection in that what are some of the surprising aspects of this type of use of rights-based language and focus on dignity issues?
Thanks, Stephen. And thanks, Shane, I think, for setting the ground so well. I mean, I think the first one is that, when you start talking about rights-based, right, it sort of starts to send alarm bells within people within the humanitarian sector, right, because they kind of feel like you're starting to talk about human rights, and that's not what we do. We're not doing that. But I think that it's important to kind of say that within the IFRC, we explicitly state that our work is driven by needs, informed by rights. And that then means that whatever we're doing, it has a rights-based approach, and so we seek to ensure that people in need are fully protected, included in line with their entitlements under international domestic law, international humanitarian law. It's the needs of those affected that we're looking at that determines how we do things, not just upholding the legal rights or holding duty bearers to account. And based on our fundamental principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and all of the other 7 that we have, these are what drives us to work towards reducing violence, discrimination, and exclusion. We use the phrase driven by needs, informed by rights, because, as I mentioned before, I think the Red Cross, or at least the national societies, and by extension IFRC, we're not a single mandate organization, right? I mean, people forget that. We are there before a crisis, we're there during a crisis, and we're there well after the crisis. We are actually there, period. And we are from local communities. So for us to just look at a humanitarian response without understanding all the needs that may be there, that come as a result of that, or that may contribute to a humanitarian crisis, means that when we will not be fulfilling our mandate. And so it is important that we speak on addressing all of those needs without discrimination, prioritizing the most urgent. It also speaks to the other aspect of what we're doing, which is on ensuring peaceful communities and peaceful societies, which has a rights-based approach there. Because within our statutes, within our constitution, peace is defined very much central to the core of the Red Cross, and it's defined as a dynamic process of cooperation amongst all states and people, founded on respect for freedom, independence, national sovereignty, equality, human rights, as well as a fair and equitable distribution of resources to meet the needs of people. That is fundamental within our constitution. That is fundamentally part of what we strive for. So there's no contradiction between sort of what we call the essence of a rights-based approach and the humanitarian principles. In fact, I think they're very complementary and really speak to what we're trying to achieve. And it is a try putting that into practice. Again, as Shaheen has sort of said, it is really trying to translate that to what this means to local communities.
Thanks so much, Amjad, and a very smooth, I think, transition to the other next point. We wanted to talk about putting things into practice, because we're looking there a bit at the policy dimension and things which can become quite abstract, even though they start out life as being very concrete, right? What is the right that people have to assistance and the right to not be subjected to certain forms of violence and so on. But we're really, action focused. So I'll turn to Naja now with this, with a bit more of a focus on programmatic work. And you've talked about programs being really the driving force of Islamic Relief Worldwide's work. And in your introduction, really citing the experience of the one individual, which is the end point that we're all trying to get to is supporting many individuals. And those programs are influencing how the policies are developed and defined. So could you elaborate a bit more on, particularly on the Gender Justice Declaration and the policy work linked to that, and how was that influenced by the programming work within the organization? And also what gaps was it trying to fill? What did you see that needed to be done with that policy and the influence of the programs?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question on what influences the other. Is it policy, programs, or advocacy? What comes first? And I would love to hear from your experience as well. I think that having a clear policy is a cornerstone. It provides guidance to our programs and our advocacy messaging. At least this was our experience in Islamic Relief. We worked on developing our gender justice policy. And from there, we rolled out components of that policy within our programs. And lately, we've been working on an external advocacy piece of work, which is called the Gender Justice Declaration in Islam, I will leave it to Shaheen to elaborate on that, because she has been leading on this project, and Islamic Relief is obviously a signatory to this declaration, but the point of this declaration is to bring together different stakeholders who work on gender and faith together. So back to your question around policy, the process of developing a policy on such a culturally influenced topic, which is gender, as you can appreciate, is not straightforward. It required a series of consultations internally with other departments, with colleagues at a country level, as well as externally with faith leaders and other organizations who work on gender. So for this policy to be representative of an organization that is diverse and not homogeneous, as you can imagine, was a very extensive piece of work, and it was finally approved in 2016. The policy itself, our gender justice policy, has 4 main components that outlines our commitments to our humanitarian work, to our development work, to some of the advocacy-related messaging, and from there we have dedicated policy or position papers on specific issues that are faith-inspired as well, in relation to, for example, early marriage or sexual and reproductive health or intimate partner violence or FGM, you name it. It depends on the topic itself, but that kind of shapes what is our position as an organization towards those issues. And the 4th component of our policy is in relation to our institutional arrangements, putting our own house in order and tackling some of the power dynamics and gender imbalance that could happen or could be witnessed in a workplace environment. So being a representative to what we stand for, reflecting on that on our own leadership, which as a result will be reflected in our program. So the 3 are interrelated, but the sequence on developing which first seemed to us that having a policy is such a crucial element, and there is a gap for that policy to fill, because having a policy will provide a mutual voice for an organization like ours, because as you mentioned, it's not an easy, straightforward piece of work. There is a lot of different dynamics and culture and context that we have to appreciate whilst working on issues that are related to protection, inclusion, and intersectionality. And that policy provides the reference point to where we stand as an organization. I hope I answered your question, Stephen, but I remember there were 3 in one.
Yeah, completely answered it. And yes, it's a sneaky trick to give you 3 questions when there's 1 really, but we're trying to squeeze as much as possible into a short time. And thank you for all of that context, which I think you might have noticed Lisa nodding quite enthusiastically already, because Lisa has been at the forefront of the gender and diversity policy, and we've been working together very closely on the protection, gender and inclusion policy most recently. So Lisa, let me give you the chance to reflect a bit on what Najat was sharing there on those related policies for IFRC. But they're focusing on that same question, that link between programming and policy, and which comes first and how they influence each other.
There, I managed to unmute. Hi, sorry, and thank you, Najat for definitely touching on some points that resonate quite strongly here with us. We're very much in a process now of revising and developing actually the first protection, gender and inclusion policy for the IFRC network. And absolutely, I mean, the diversity of our members, the contexts and the needs that they see on the ground, and how they also continuously, all of the staff and volunteers around the world continuously innovate themselves as well. So, and find new ways of tackling problems that we desperately need to find, better solutions for. So for us as the Secretariat is always a bit of a challenge to keep up and to capture all of those experiences and practices. And to listen, really, because you're asking, Stephen, and I think this is extremely important. As you know, I'm very passionate about this. The importance of making sure that policy is operational and useful for actual, actions, but also the other way around, making sure that our actions keep informing our policies as we revise them and develop them. It is very challenging indeed, because the policy dimension of our, of our organization is really where we try to elaborate on our universalities, to put it that way. It's really where we try to detail what is common to us all and what are our joint and shared objectives and goals, and what are we committing to. And for that to be appropriate and meaningful in any kind of way, we have to really listen to the entire membership, to their experiences, and to what barriers they're facing on the ground. I find it very interesting that you were talking about your own, the inwards looking part of all of this as well, because for us, what we've seen over the last years, especially, I think, is that although we've made some progress in our programs and operations in mainstreaming protection, gender and inclusion, mitigation, especially measures in our big emergency responses, we keep seeing also that the same barriers are, there comes a certain point where there's a bottleneck, where there's a barrier that can only be addressed if we look at ourselves, if we look at our own teams and our own delegations and our own training programs, etc., recruitment processes. So to me, it's very much a two-way process. We have to continuously look, are our policies relevant to what's actually happening? And are we actually implementing our policies? So we have to kind of keep that dual perspective all of the time. And I think from my experience, what has been a very, very important enabler to do that is all of the little pieces in between policy and implementation. So our strategic frameworks and our training programs and our, the way that we develop a learning pathway, how to make sure that we actually provide the tools to staff and volunteers to be able to interpret a policy into action, but also to be able to tell us when their actions are revealing new needs for our policy dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, the very similar kind of challenges and similar kind of solutions as well, which is interesting. So turning to Shaheen again, looking at one particular solution, and as mentioned, Najah Shaheen has been really leading the Gender Justice Declaration process. So specifically on that, we were interested to know how has that process supported the type of approach that you were describing above, where we don't just look at, PSCA as a separate issue and child protection as a separate issue, but bringing a number of protection, gender inclusion issues together. And then, as is my tendency to kind of squeeze a second question into the first question, how has the faith aspect of the organization supported that approach of using something like that declaration to support the integration?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Lisa. I think that middle bit, I think, is really, really important, because I think there are blockers and there are always barriers, and it's about how we overcome those and what are in the particularly country context, what is it that is required to kind of bridge that gap, and what is it that we've tried all different methods. What happens when an organization needs something else to kind of bring that or bridge that? I think is a really important question. In answer to your question, Stephen, I will always say this, and I keep saying it, gender is a prerequisite to PSEAH. If you don't understand gender, you will always have safeguarding issues. You will always never understand, the rights of individuals in this space. And whether that's looking at in terms of power dynamics in all different contexts, or whether that intersects with, ethnicity, it intersects with class, it intersects with religion, gender identity, status, they all intersect. So you've got to understand where gender stands in your organization. And often what happens is that if that is not a prerequisite, then all these other things become like secondary things, but we have to recognize them in cultural context. In this, we acknowledge that there are inequitable norms and unequal power that was mentioned before, like Najah has said. These dynamics we see at all absolutely different stages of where we are, and as NGOs and as international NGOs and as, you know, as governments and likewise. But what you see is this particular declaration in working in this sector for such a long time, the declaration itself spearheads not only issues around protection, but also with aspects of, for example, female Muslim leadership, you know, including understanding the truth from within the Muslim contexts. You know, from our consultations, and Stephen, these took 3 years, the evidence suggested that the current systems and structures of power around the world have specifically marginalized or oppressed the voices, the agency, and the participation of women in both private and the public spaces. And as a result of that, you do see a situation of inequality, you see exploitation, you see suffering, you see women and girls in any given situation are always the worst affected. So on top of that, Stephen, you know, you see there's also a silent undercurrent of unconscious biases that we all have. And these emerge particularly in relation to women's authority. For women, these harmful biases are real and we really feel them and they are present. Women are judged more harshly, but taken less seriously. With their expertise, and their expertise are often overlooked. And, you know, these biases, again, are exacerbated for women of color. And, you know, through these consultations, what we showed is that when we worked with local communities, who we have to understand already have strong bases of diverse human, cultural, including spiritual and social capital that support the efforts within their contexts that bridge the divide between religion and development practice. So the declaration itself, Stephen, is an ambition precluded by what we're going to call the Stand Up for Justice campaign. It is a landmark initiative, and, you know, it does address key faith principles of justice and balance, to challenge some of the harmful practices and the ideas and the social conditions that we find ourselves in. You know, the declaration itself affirms the God-given rights of all human beings and to stand up and uphold justice. My final point on this is that we see that from a context of over there. I want to talk about the context here as well, where we are sitting. You know, we are privileged people to be on this call today. And even when we're in Muslim minority countries within the West, more often than not, Stephen, we are excluded through the implication that we're simply not good enough, that we don't belong. And essentially you see some of the language around the othering in this space. So not only is this declaration a very timely piece, but it also tackles the very essence of what is concealed within the deepest of structures. The declaration aims to inspire change, mobilize action within our communities, as well as through advocacy at all levels, local, national, and global. It also aims to work with kind of Muslim stakeholders and those who are not of the faith to work in unity to promote interfaith, cross-sector partnerships, and invites both faith-based and secular organizations to pledge their commitment to ending, you know, gender injustice as signatories. And my final point is that, you know, faith, values, and beliefs, Stephen, are an integral part of any society, and they have a tangible impact on the lives of people. Yet the call for justice is one that transcends boundaries and gives us all here at IFRC and Islamic5 a common sense of purpose and identity, going back to our original question. It comes at a time when we see divisions that are so precious, that our shared humanity, you know, in this place must be emphasized. The declaration is something that we feel that bridges, that gives us the continuity, the consolidation and hope, and particularly in these challenging times. And you asked me a question earlier, Stephen, about what was challenging. From the challenge, I'll give you a hope as well. From the declaration, we worked with our CEO, and we're currently, I've just come off a call, currently working on the 10 CEO commitments on the gender declaration. And these will be given out to 40 of our countries. It's about gender sensitive budgeting to leadership. And those are also our commitments, but they were also our challenges, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Shaheen. I think just kind of want to sign up onto the declaration straight away after this very motivating description of it as a bridge between different organizations, and it's a wonderful achievement there, and I think hopefully will be very there'll be a lot of take up of that. As we started out with that question, it links in different ways, I mean, to that's driving a lot of that integrated approach for you. Amjad, we wanted to maybe reflect a bit on what are the ways in which the principles of the movement and other aspects of the kind of underlying policy frameworks within the movement are doing that same kind of role for IFRC to support that, the integrated approach that we're promoting. Thanks,
Stephen. Yeah, and I think I've already told Shaheen that at some point we will be looking at supporting that, but we're a big tanker, the IFRC, so that the processes of approval are a little bit more challenging. But no, I think the integrated approach for us really speaks to why we even calling our work protection, gender inclusion. Right? We don't sort of say that we have a gender diversity work and then we have a protection work. They're all interconnected, and that's because what we want to do is to sort of say that we need to have a contextualized approach to addressing the causes, the risks, the consequences of violence, discrimination, exclusion. So whilst protection and inclusion sort of refer to specific actions you take to eliminate and mitigate various risks, the gender diversity lens allows us the multitude of looking at the intersecting factors that we need to work on. So it is that perspective. That is why we've been very keen, particularly over the last 5 years, to really look at a PGI approach. So often we don't. It's difficult because internally we call it PGI because that's what we mean. But when we go outside, people ask, "Who's your gender person?" I'm like, well, actually, yes, we have someone who's potentially sort of there, but actually the people who work in the PGI team are all working on this issue, because all of them are working at different perspectives. And so it's important because, particularly, as I said, when you go to national societies who are our primary clients, they don't have the luxury of having a specific person to work on protection, a specific person to work on gender. Often they have one person who's doing everything, right? And so what we need to do is provide them the necessary tools to kind of help them to work on that on the field. The other issue as well is that a lot of these things are very much linked. So, as Shaheen was saying, you can't really talk around PSCA or child protection if there's no understanding what gender is. So how can you expect an organization or national society to do a program on sexual gender-based violence if they don't really have an understanding of what gender diversity, if there's no policy in place that really helps them to view that lens? How can we expect to work on issues on child protection or work on issues of sexual exploitation and abuse if there's no work that's sort of mobilizing with our youth and volunteers and that is teaching our fundamental principles and values? So that is why, even within the team that I manage, you have education, you have youth, you have PGI, because they are very much seen as linked. And you have to work on the whole thing. So you can't just work on mainstreaming in programs. You have to work on the ecosystem. You have to build that ecosystem. And as Najah said, if you don't have the policy in place, often people often, leadership is very good at sort of criticizing, you guys are just doing policies. But actually policies help to provide a framework from how you can approach the programs on the ground. And so it's important that we look at that. And all of this, of course, is based on our fundamental principles that we work on. Like Islamic5 has their principles. I mean, the recursive principles are there. I often joke with some of my colleagues that we are, whether we like it or not, we can be seen to be a little bit of a faith-based organization because we believe fundamentally in the principles. We go to Solferino every year for our walk. So, we fully fundamentally believe in that. And like many faith-based organizations, our volunteers are driven not for anything else, but because they fully believe in that. Mm-hmm. So the principles sort of provide a basis for our work. And it allows us to really contextualize what that means in practice. Thanks.
Thanks, Amjad. Yes, I think we've in those discussions we've been noticing more and more some of the interesting similarities between what it means to be, or what actually means to be a faith-based organization or a principle-based organization, with a lot of positive, comparisons are odious, said Shakespeare, of course, but very interesting to find like-minded organizations and people. I think that's what's been interesting here. And coming back to that, I mean, we've already mentioned a number of times some of the kind of, the benefits of looking at the institutional issues to be able to get the policy issues approved and to be able to get the programs working. And one aspect of that is something that, Lisa, I'll turn to you, because many times over the years you've said a little bit tongue-in-cheek maybe that our internal advocacy is more of a problem than our external advocacy, and certainly we need to spend a lot of time doing internal advocacy. So could you just elaborate a bit on this, what that means?
Yeah, I keep saying that, a bit of frustration sometimes. I feel like 70% of my job is, talking about what we are doing with colleagues, and not just, not even doing it or improving the efforts. But part of that, over the years, I've realized that conversation, of course, it's not just out of frustration that we do it. It's because of the value of understanding our own membership and our own colleagues and our own different levels of organization. Because we really are a local organization, right? It starts with community members becoming volunteers, becoming staff, becoming leaders of our national societies. And as a secretariat, we kind of just serve that membership. So without having that continuous internal conversation, we won't really get anywhere. And I would say, yeah, I do think still we have challenges. We see that we're getting resonance, and it's not about commitment necessarily. I don't feel that so often I have to convince someone that we have to do protection, gender and inclusion. It's much more often about the how, and that we need to do it all together. That intersectionality, really, exactly that. I find I have to repeat myself quite often just to go through, what if there's this one young girl, she's 14 years old, she has all of these challenges in her life, and then to see that it's not just being a girl, it's not just being 14, it's all of the things, and we're so complex as individuals. So that's the part of advocacy that I find, but maybe pedagogical exercises is a more appropriate term to use, because I do find that we have quite a lot of commitment within our organization, within national societies. It's really more about coming together on a more effective approach and a more meaningful approach.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's on the Zoom screen here. It's very interesting to watch. Each of you nodding as the other one speaking and kind of just going, yeah, I know what you mean. So, and I noticed Nadja nodding particularly there. So let me ask you, Nadja, on this. I think you have a similar kind of experience around this internal advocacy need and trying to find the best way to do that.
Absolutely, Lisa, I hear you, I feel you, I can resonate with every single thing you said. If I can refer back to our policy, quarter of our policy was actually dedicated to what we call the institutional arrangements and addressing those power imbalances that exist within the organization itself. So acknowledging that it is an issue and understanding its relevance to our work is essential, and it's part of our job as a gender protection inclusion lead, or whatever is the sequence of our titles. I think what we did in Islamic Relief is kind of to honor that commitment that we have in our policy, which takes me back to the point that it is important to have a policy, is in 2019, 2020, we did our first gender audit review. So we hired external consultants to look at our own commitments that we have in our policy and reflect on those commitments in terms of our programs, in terms of our policies, procedures, hiring staff, female leadership. They did interviews, staff surveys, just to get a sense internally on how well have we been doing in implementing the commitments that we have in our policy. And this gender audit review came out with a set of recommendations that are taken on board to provide that equitable work environment to both males and females within the organization. And lately, we've been working on creating a gender steering group, again, for that internal advocacy and internal buy-in as part of our work as a gender lead within the organization. And since the recommendations that came out of the gender audit, that was back in 2020, we have a new leadership. We have a new CEO, a new head of programs. So we're hoping that with new leadership, that a lot of those recommendations will actually manifest into actions. I think back to the point that Amjad also mentioned in relation to having frameworks. It is very important for us to have those frameworks, and those frameworks to be measurable and something that all the different stakeholders within the organization can relate to and can measure in one way or another. So when we talk about gender justice, it's not just a conceptual term, but rather something that is doable and actionable. It's you don't need to be a gender expert to advocate for more female leadership in within the organization or equal job opportunities. That does not require any extra expertise. It just requires faith and buy-in and how important that reflection is internally for it to reflect in the communities that we work and for us to actually walk the talk.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that, Najah. So we have about 32 minutes left, and I do want to have some time for questions and answers, but there's so many, interesting things to hear from you. It will be slightly shorter than some of the other forums, perhaps. Let me go to one or two more questions, and then whilst we're hearing your responses on that, people are welcome, encouraged actually to put some questions in the chat or to think through what question you might want to ask to one or two of the panelists, and we'll try to have at least 20 minutes or so where we can have a bit of a conversation. But Amjad, maybe you just want to respond a little bit to some of the points that Najah was mentioning there. I think some of that phrasing and ideas around walking the talk and focus on leadership, there's some aspects of IFRC's work on that would be interesting to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that we've realized, particularly as IFRC secretariats, I'm talking about the 2,000 staff who are working there to support the national societies. One thing that we realize is when we go to national societies and we talk to them about, establishing all these policies and frameworks and kind of developing that, one thing that's always a pushback is, okay, what are you doing about it in Geneva and in the regional offices, right? So I think precisely it's that walking the talk that is important to do. So I think one thing that there is a whole process there that is going about it. Now, part of that is also helping people to understand that just because we have gender in our title doesn't mean that anything that has gender on it, even if it's a question to the Secretary General, sort of has to end up on our desks to answer, because that's not what we're supposed to be there for, right? I think it's, as Lisa was saying, there's like everyone has a role to play. You don't need to be that gender expert, but you can have a certain awareness of what needs to be done. And I think that's the key thing that we need to do. So the key thing is very sort of modeling what we're planning to do, pushing through that what we say PGI is everyone's business. So everyone needs to be sensitive to it. Everyone needs to be aware of it. Everyone needs to have some level of sensitivity to what to do. The other thing, of course, is that when we talk around sort of walking the talk, it's not sort of gender diversity, it is that intersectionality. How are we representing the communities that we serve? When we did our strategy 2030 years ago, one of the questions that came up, particularly from volunteers, was we'd like to see more of us in the federation, right? So currently we don't have that luxury. We are still very much skewed of who's represented. We still have those conversations around who has the power, and normally the power comes from the traditional donors. So I think that there's a lot of questions that we need to answer. Are our cultures speaking to the real lived experience of the people on the ground? I don't think it is. I think we're not fully understanding that. So I think that there's a number of things that we need to think about that is there. We of course have made, and it's always good to make these pledges. So we have statutory meetings where we make a pledge on having the need for policies, having the need for safe and inclusive workspace. There's a number of things in process at the moment to address discrimination and xenophobia and look at these issues. So part of that is policy development, but part of that is also a sort of interdepartmental process in the Federation that's involving HR, that's involving the Office of Secretary General, that's involving our team to look at sort of values, to look at diversity, equity, inclusion through an appreciative inquiry process that will hopefully try and address some of these perspectives so that we can provide guidance to national societies that are there. Of course, there are the pledges that have been made for gender equity parity at leadership level. You know, we kind of did did one round of that probably in 2020, and then we weren't able to. This is when you kind of figure out that there's the intersectionality of that, right? So you can have, for example, gender parity, but then you suddenly realize that you don't have geographic parity because you're achieving that. So I think that there's a number of different perspectives that are there. And the other thing I think perhaps we probably need to think about is what does that conversation look like in a COVID with a COVID lens, right? What does a diversity, equity, inclusion, what is gender parity, what does that look like with COVID lens? And I don't think we're fully there yet. So I think these are some of the challenges that we have to take the conversation forward. But I think there is commitment, and I think that's a start. I mean, and you know, congratulations to Islamic Relief for doing your gender audit, where we are trying to develop our own organizational assessment, which is still in work. And so, you know, we haven't yet succeeded to do a proper analysis. I think we did one in one of our regional offices. So, you know, I think the pressure is to really do that. But then it's also what you do afterwards, right? What you do afterwards. How do you put those processes in place to address these issues and to address that it's not just about you know, gender parity. But it's about ensuring that we understand what that intersectionality of identities look like.
Great, thanks for that very comprehensive run through of some of the ways that we've been looking at those issues, and indeed a number more. So yeah, we're coming up. We have a little bit less than half an hour left, and I don't see any questions in the chat yet. In a minute, I'll invite people to maybe open their microphone and share their questions. But there's one other one that certainly comes up a lot. I mean, certainly comes up in our discussions a lot, and we've touched on it already. It's perhaps partly the driving ambition of all of you and your colleagues to try to do kind of everything all the time to address all of those protection and gender inclusion issues around the whole world, you know, between Friday evening and Monday morning. And that leads to the fact that the resources don't match the needs, right? And I think we have that particular difficulty within the PGI area of work. So that is a bit of a challenge, right? Stretched very thinly, staff with a lot of ambition and a lot of drive, but stretched very thinly to cover a whole range of very complex issues, each issue itself requiring quite a lot of time and effort and energy. So how have we been addressing that challenge? It's maybe a permanent challenge, but what are some of the permanent, at least, attempts to address that solution? Maybe Naja, Shaheen, either of you would like to respond? Naja, do you want to go first with some thoughts? And maybe we'll keep these responses a bit brief so we have time for some questions, but some of the key things to address that challenge.
Sure. It's a challenge, and it will always be a challenge. As Amjad mentioned, it's everyone's job, which sometimes makes it no one's job, but still someone has to lead on it because there is a gap. And obviously that lead is usually placed at a headquarters level. How can that cascade at a country level is something that we've been piloting. So I would say sharing some of the learning and from our experience over the past few years, we've done two things, which I think you can resonate with in IFRC. From what I hear, you're kind of doing the exact same things. We tried to bring together all the different cross-cutting issues in relation to protection and inclusion. So we don't speak about gender as its own, although it's a technical area and can be a standalone job by itself, but we speak about protection and inclusion in terms of child protection, age and disability, inclusion of older people and children at the same time. So we try to bring all those different thematic areas under one umbrella that is called the protection and inclusion. And with that, we developed our own internal framework that is very similar to the sector's language when it comes to ensuring that there is enough gender analysis that responds to the needs of all different intersectional identities or social groups, that the programs have been adapted, participation, and so on. And the other approach, which we've been piloting since 2017, is to actually embed a dedicated staff, someone who would wear that hat around protection and inclusion at a country level. We started with 3 country offices, and then we expanded to 6 and 8. And we're hoping that that framework will cascade across all our country offices. Obviously, there is a challenge here, which is funding, which we can all nod to. It is a challenge, it's a dedicated job and has to be incorporated into different budgets and proposals right from the get-go. And the other challenge is obviously timing and the nature of our sector. It's usually short-term programming that lasts for a year, whilst we're trying to create a position that goes beyond a specific program. So yeah, we are in the same boat, trying to figure it out together.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Najah, all sounds very familiar. So maybe I'll ask Amjad just to add any particular points that aren't mentioned or particular points of commonality, and then we'll turn to the questions in the chat.
Thanks. No, I think, I mean, the commonality is, there has to be a focal point to actually tie these things together. And we have that at the regions, but of course, then the challenge is how do you sustain it? Because a lot of those are related to the program funding, and so you have to kind of look at that that key element. But I think the other thing that we've tried to do, particularly over the last 2 years, is really now we have this new policy coming out that is really again setting the framework and how the federation wants to work on these issues, which then clearly states these are some of this is where we need you to work on that. We have an operational framework, and we have tried to prioritize certain things that we can do as a secretariat, and then focus on that. And for us, the main aspect of it is really then focusing on national societies, because they are my clients. So it has to build and support how they can respond. But ultimately, the difficulty is on human and financial resources. I think that's a conversation that we all struggle with, and we all sort of need to figure out how to do better.
Great, thank you, Amjad, for that summary. Indeed, touching on some of the touch points or pain points sometimes of trying to find the right balance between coverage and having people with a focus. So with that, let me turn to some of the questions in the chat, which are very much related to some themes that we've been discussing in the past. And the first one actually was a question that we've been looking at. Could IFRC, this is coming from Kaiser in ICRC, could the panel members talk about key elements of success when working with community members and faith leaders to prevent violence, and maybe how to sustain those good practices? So either Najah or Shaheen would like to respond from Islamic Relief?
I think Najah, because we can mention the COH here, Najah.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
I feel I've talked a lot. I'll try to be brief. I think when it comes to working with a faith lens, a very important element is building trust. And we, as Islamic Relief, I would say, have been blessed with that kind of trust that we manage to build over time.
Yeah.
Working on gender issues cannot happen overnight. It cannot happen as an intervention of one single project. It is a long-term programming, again, which is a challenge due to the nature of our sector. But one of the key elements to success is building that trust and speaking in a language that the community can understand and relate to. I very much would love to speak with the sector's language, but sometimes it's even difficult to translate. And I think, Shaheen, we've been going through that over and over again, that the words such as gender does not have a translation in languages, for example, Arabic. We end up using the word gender, and this space or this gap creates more resistance at a community level. It is important for us to speak in a language that the community can understand and relate to. And that's something that will require time, effort, a lot of resources have to be built into it for it to succeed. And I think the nature of our programs being, for example, a humanitarian or a development program, in a sense that we are providing a service. So when it comes to tackling gender issues or building awareness around a specific topic, it has to come as a component within a program and not as a standalone project. And a lot of organizations end up doing, I would say, advocacy-related projects as a standalone project without providing anything in return. And I don't think that that approach seems to be working because it becomes external. It's not something that community members can relate to. And that the importance of having strategic vision to including faith as an important element of tackling gender issues has to be culturally sensitive as well. Shaheen, do you want to add?
Well, I will turn to Lisa because we've got a few more questions and it would be great to get through a couple more if you don't mind, Shaheen. Thank you. Yeah, Lisa, we talked a lot about trust. I think that resonates a lot with some of the strengths of national societies. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how that happens at the local level?
It's one of my favorite things to be honored to witness or accompany when out in the field, or to be able to listen to or observe, to put it that way, because it's very rarely something that I would be responsible of ensuring best practice of. Most of the time in a big emergency response or wherever I go, you know, I'm not from there. It's not very often that I do these activities in Norway anymore, although I used to before. And I know that from that side as well, I think the absolute key to any success in working with community members and faith leaders on preventing violence is listening, and listening without trying to fit whatever is being said into our boxes and log frames. Mm-hmm. Listening to what they're actually saying, for their words, exactly what you said, Naja. In Cox's Bazar, we had a focus group discussion facilitated by a colleague from Bangladesh Red Crescent Society with men and boys related to sexual and gender-based violence, or more specifically intimate partner violence and family violence. And he was asking, is there any gender-based violence here? And that term is so specific to our like technical ways of working, and it doesn't work in the real world. I mean, people, you know, it's such a geeky way of talking about it, to put it that way. And no one really replied. It was this insecure kind of response. And in the end, there was a young man who raised his hand and he said, well, my grandmother does get quite angry. And I mean, just to say that these misinterpretations, because he was using the word woman, is there any women-based violence here? And that's how they heard that word. So it really just, you know, whatever the topic is, we have to listen more than we talk, which is why I'm going to stop there.
That's a good end line. Yeah. A couple of other questions that we can maybe get some short, quick responses to. Jamie Williams from Islamic Relief is asking whether we could have some reflections on the gender issues in the localization agenda. I think the two last responses actually touch on that quite well, but maybe I'll ask Shaheen to elaborate a little bit more. I think you're nodding, you'd see what I mean, but some reflections on that. How do we make that happen then, that the localization agenda is gender sensitive?
I mean, there's there's quite a bit there, Jamie and Stephen. I think gender responsive localization will require, and I'll just put it into several bullet points, which is you need access to financing. One, you've got to make sure that the local funds that we have are institutionalized and they strengthen the local organizations. You can talk about an increased access to humanitarian funding, making sure that it's multi-year, make sure it's flexible, and make sure that there's sustainable funds. You've got to ensure equitable partnership in institutionalizing and strengthening that. For example, when you're looking at establishing long-term partnerships, you've got to allow for growth. Then you've got to allow for in the process, you've got to allow for accountability and then transparency, knowledge sharing. You're talking about sustainable management at the same time. And part of that is the narrative around gender equality, the empowerment of women and girls in this space. Again, in this space, there's, humanitarian needs and assessment planning. How does that happen if you don't have the financing? And everybody's spoken about that already. You're talking about humanitarian coordination in this space. I think the biggest thing I find is the lack of women's leadership in this space. And that's one of the really important issues that we need to work on when it comes to gender responsive localization processes. If you don't expand the localization to include women's organizations or self-organized groups of women, you'll never tackle the problem of localization, because ultimately what you'll find is that there will always be a separation, and maybe that's the gap. There will always be this notion of cultural notions of women's leadership being drawn upon from other specificities, and then we come in with our imperialistic language and say, this is how we need it because it fits into our log frame. And that imperialism in our language also needs to be looked at when it comes to gender responsive localization, because we shouldn't use our language. Lisa, you spoke about listening. I was talking about language as well, and how we use language to knowledge build, to access resources, to enable exchange of information, to ensure that this leadership that we want to create, making sure that when, we are the organization that will leave eventually, and these are the people that will stay. So you need to probably think about more about how we do that in this space. And I feel as though women's leadership, the humanitarian coordination, the equitable partnerships, and the access to financing are really key and critical. And thank you for your question, Jamie.
And thank you for your response, Shaheen, very comprehensive as usual. And particularly like this point on imperialistic or colonializing type of language, geeky language or jargonistic language, it ends up being a bit distancing. The language is describing itself something which is distancing. So maybe for Amjad, thinking of, the many discussions you've had with national societies over the years, when we're talking about gender issues in the localization agenda, but bringing that down to something much more simple, what are national societies doing that achieves that purpose of having a, let's say, homegrown and fair and equal approach to the work they're doing?
That's a good question, Stephen. I think part of the challenge, I think, to what Shaheen, Lisa, and Najah have talked about, which is this issue of language, which is this issue of understanding that for many national societies and in fact many local organizations, right, they don't have the luxury of having dedicated people. And so I think what we need to be able to understand is the roles that they play. For example, many local organizations, they have multiple roles to kind of move in. So you have people who are maybe social activists who suddenly, because there's an onset of a humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian role, or women peace builders who suddenly become humanitarians, or humanitarians become women peace builders. Yet within our frameworks, we don't see them because they're not strictly humanitarians, or they're working in a different sector. And so I think the question for us is how do we sort of allow space for that? How do we include them in that conversation? I was just before this call, I was on another call where we were talking about sort of gender issues in humanitarian work and localization, and everyone around the call were all from international agencies, and none of us had a local partner there. And for me, that was the start of a problem. I was like, you've not even brought one of your local partners to this call to talk around these issues, right? And so you start to compartmentalize this, and we love working in these silos, right? Because it just adds another working committee, it adds another terms of reference, and we start to work on these guidances. So I think what we need to do is to break that. I mean, and then I think part of what sort of onto Kaylee's question in the chat, which is around accountability. So part of how we kind of get national societies working on that is through our statutory processes, right? So there's a bit of a carrot and the stick situation, right? Where basically you put these statutory processes in place, people agree to changing their constitutions, to working on the policies and everything else, and then they forget after the General Assembly because it's been there, and then so you go back to them and so say your leadership has now agreed that you have to do this. So that's the carrot, and then let's help you to work through that. Let's help you to understand that. So I think there has to be an element of a carrot and the stick to help them to feel accountable. That's the statutory processes, and then to allow them to understand that, you know, by doing that, their programming gets better, and then they're able to actually access better funds or be able to work in a better way. Now, we are also facing from donors a lot more pressure. So the stick is becoming even bigger, right? So donors are expecting now our agencies to be client on PSCA and gender diversity, all of that thing. My challenge, my fear is that it doesn't become a tick box exercise that we do just to kind of satisfy the donors, and that's where I think, like the gender declaration, I think is important for us to not make this just a tick box exercise.
Thank you, Amjad. I think particularly for guarding against tick box exercise, especially in a context where the stick is getting bigger and the carrot is perhaps getting smaller, and a lot more people chasing one carrot, if that doesn't stretch the metaphor too far. Thank you so much, everyone, for these discussions. We're coming towards the end, and in the preparation for this, I think partly maybe having talked so much about intersectionality and having talked about the importance of the personal and the professional, we've been talking with Najah and Shaheen, also having read a lot of what they've published in the past about a topic that they've touched on of being a Muslim, being a feminist and a humanitarian practitioner, and the compatibility of these three. That is maybe not an obvious compatibility to everybody who may have a slightly, let's say, incomplete vision of any of those three elements. So we did say it would be interesting to just share a bit of your reflections on that, and the interpretation, perhaps particularly for IFRC colleagues, of feminism from an Islamic perspective, and how that, you know, is a part of your professional work in the intersectional approach, and how it relates to your personal drive to do that type of work. Let me start with you, Najah, because it was an article you wrote that kicked off that reflection.
It's such a difficult question. We're tapping into our own identities and our own biases and our own worldview and the different factors that influences our position. So it's not very easy to examine all of that. I think it's due to COVID and working from home that you start thinking more about all those different factors. It's such a shame that we all have kind of a one mainstreamed image of what a Muslim should look, behave, or even think like, and a one image as well of what a feminist, be it a man or a woman, should look, behave, or even think like. And both seem to be at an opposite positions of the spectrum, and anything in between seems to be irrelevant. And that's why there is a lot of debate around the compatibility of those two different intersectional identity that I would identify myself as being both a Muslim and a feminist and a humanitarian practitioner. Being a Muslim or a person of faith means that a lot of people choose to follow a religion with all its practices without questioning. And unfortunately, those questions are important because we receive those rules and practices through faith leaders who are also culturally influenced. So kind of delinking that culture and religion is not easy, and it's not straightforward. At the same time, a lot of feminists have created an anti-religious narrative, which it's usually a white, Western-centric. So a lot of Muslim women find themselves lost in between. I think there is a responsibility on both, on feminist scholars as well as Muslim and faith scholars, to find that middle ground. And simply to answer your question, it's a journey that we all embark in our own unique ways. Just examining our own beliefs and values. And I feel that I strongly believe in equality, and I strongly believe in justice. And I think that those two are fundamental for both Islam and feminism. So in my point of view, I think they are both compatible. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I might not have the right vocabulary to kind of explain the compatibility. I'm not there yet, but it's a passion, and it's a driving force, and it's something that keeps me going forward.
I think you're doing pretty well on the vocabulary, to be honest, Nadia. That was very really spoke to me, at least. We are running short of time, but I would love to hear a few reflections from you, Shaheen, on this topic. A bit unfair to squeeze it into a brief statement, but what's your... No
problem. And Stephen, I think that's better for you, because I can go on for ages. So I mean, my term, and so it's interesting where Najah has come from, and so my narrative around this falls around the women of color narrative. And we've been kind of given multiple today. We've been given I've given multiple examples of how we do not fit into meaningful access spaces. We don't fit into feminist organizations, Stephen. We could have been part of that process, and we could progress in claiming those rights, but often we are marginalized in those spaces. And so in that space, you also see us marginalized in, let's call it a spade. We are often marginalized in women's networks in larger organizations and larger institutions as well. So, for me, there is still this massive unconscious bias about who comes up the ranks when it talks about feminism. Who is it that we want to see at that space? Who is it that is going to lead the women feminist movement? And it certainly isn't a woman of color sometimes. And it doesn't matter how much effort you put in the bottom of the pipeline, it will never change, for example, in our sector, what the top of the sector looks like. So if I talk about feminism within this space, I would like to see the top sector of this space changing to ensure that we become a very, we talk about rights-based narratives, we talk about progress and we claim our rights. And I would like to see meaningful access for women of color in these spaces. So, one of the things I want to say is that the space we're in, is complex, it's dynamic, it's messy, and it cannot be achieved by just me as one single person or one strategy alone. It has to be linear relationships that, Amjad has, that Stephen has, that you have, Stephen, that Najah has, that, that Lisa has. We input and we have these outcomes. And for me, I think where we see lots of that change is in advocacy. We see a lot of it in resistance education. We see a lot of it in services and organizing. But a lot of it is to do with changing our behavior. One of the things that I probably leave you with is, there is an excitement to be in this space, but also there's a massive caution for me as a Muslim woman. We need to bring something new and we need to bring something fresh, but we also need to make secular feminists understand that we are part of this discourse. We are not against this discourse. But in fact, what you see is many feminist social movements who point out and legitimize the patriarchal structures within certain religions, and then people like us fall on the wayside. And, we speak on public platforms, as Najah has said, but women don't follow up on those kind of significant changes that benefit all women, not just a certain group of women. I think, in fact, the fear among feminist movements includes the fear of engaging with any form of faith-based men and women who refuse to affirm gender equality, and I get that. But not only has this caused fear, but people who are faith-based feminists, who struggle, who are no different to the secular feminists, get lumped together with a conservative element of religion, and specifically those of their religious affiliation. But in this, one of us develops a cultural inferiority. Mm-hmm. And then what I see is that there is, I fear, in what we see as cognitive diversity that we all speak about, which is obviously overtly welcome, but what we see, the practice in the end, is covertly unwelcome.
Thank you, Shaheen. Very inspiring once again. We are at the end of time. I'm sure everybody has something else to go to, but I would like to just see, Amjad, if you want to share brief reflections, or it's maybe too short to convey a lot that you have to say, but I want to give you the chance to chip in.
No, thank you. And I mean, you know, what Shaheen and Najat said, I mean, really resonates very strongly. I think the key thing from my perspective is particularly when we talk in our sector, right? We often don't want to talk around faith, right? I think we always have this side that faith, we don't do faith is a common kind of frame within the secular space. And I think what we need, faith is part of the lived experience of the people that we serve, but also part of the people who work with us. And for us, if you truly want to be inclusive, you know, we have to understand that identity that we all have, and we talk about multiple identity, that identity we have, that faith identity that I have, is part of who we are, part of what makes us tick, part of what makes us work in the organizations that we work. I, as a Muslim, you know, part of why I work in IFRC is also fed from my own faith of serving. It's the same thing that I share with Shaheen and with Najat, with all the people on this room. So I think we need to be much more comfortable in engaging with faith, because that is a lived experience, and then to actually have that understanding and that conversation and that dialogue. I think that's the step. So maybe that's what I'd like to leave us with. Let us be a little bit more open to having that conversation, and which is why I was very keen as well that we start a conversation with Islamic Relief, because there's much we can share, and there's much we can exchange together, because I think that together then we're much more enriched to move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Amjad. And I'll just offer Lisa, any last reflections from you on this enriching to move forward from any of the aspects of what we've been talking about, and then we'll draw it to a close. Muted.
Sorry. Wow, this keyboard. No, I really, really appreciated what was just shared by Najat and Shaheen and Amjad as well. And I don't, I know that I find myself quite often saying in trainings or in meetings that, you know, we need to make this not be about someone looking like me coming in and putting, you know, policies on people's head or rules or driving initiatives. It's not how it works. And yes, a lot of, you know, I would say the feminist advancements or achievements have come from certain parts of the world that are still dominating it in different ways. But this is very much in a power space that hasn't been accessible to everyone. It's not because they were the feminists before everyone else. It's because it was a privileged space that was accessible for certain women, right? And for certain feminists. And we need to come together and open up that space. I mean, this is just, to me, this is obvious. For anything to be meaningful in this work, this has to be opened up.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for ending on that theme of opening up. And we are just a couple of minutes over, but so I'll just thank you all for sharing your personal reflections, professional reflections, and it's been, of course, as we expected, a very rich discussion. We've touched on policy, we've touched on programs, intersectionality, different manifestations of faith in organizations work, different manifestations of feminism, and it's rare, I think, to have an opportunity to get into these type of details, but we see how it really does have an impact on the work that we do, right? And we see how those aspects of ourselves, and we're all intersectional beings, right? It's really driving us to try to make some differences, and that allows us to really have that reflection. And what's been, I think, from the beginning and to the end, very fascinating is to organizations who don't work together particularly often and have quite a different trajectory, but in fact have so much commonality. in terms of let's say putting principles into practice above everything else. So thank you so much for sharing all of the details on that. And thank you to the many of you who attended from both organizations, and for those who asked questions and made a few comments. It's been a great pleasure to host this discussion, and we will, as we do with all of these PGI learning forums, have the recording available on video on YouTube and on audio on Spotify, and those links will be shared very soon. So thanks so much, and look forward to further discussions on similar themes and further work together on this type of approach. Thanks everybody, have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Nice discussion. Bye.